Diving deeper into the mysteries revolving the Alpha Legion, we not only find that there were no cultures whose genetics could be traced back to old Terra within the Legion itself. As it seems, it materialized fully formed, with no recruitment logs, no training records, just there. Tens of thousands of perfectly equipped legionaries, and a fleet that moved like they had been veterans of 100 campaigns. Imperial logistics couldn't even confirm what color they actually wore, much less where they came from. Some reports at times would list them as being a shimmering blue-green, while another would report them as black. One quartermaster would famously state, "It was as if the 20th Legion appeared whole cloth, already seasoned and quite determined to ignore any attempt to account for it." Even their name wasn't consistent. While Alpha Legion eventually stuck within Imperial records, field reports show them calling themselves the Unbroken Chain, the Coiled Hydra, and most ominously, the Harrowing, a title they used during the Predifiction Gap exterminations, and more fittingly, whenever one of their warriors spoke, they always seemed to share the name Alfarius. To outsiders, it was quite maddening. However, to the Alpha Legion, it was a sign of unity, maybe even misdirection. Hard to say which, due to the circles within circles mentality that defines the Alpha Legion. Some after-action records suggest a darker reason behind their strange behavior. During one particular campaign, alongside the Clarakash Auxilia against the Crave at Memlock, analysts discovered something unsettling. Code names used by the Alpha Legion operatives exactly matched the names of citizens from a world a legion had previously exterminated. Whether this was a coincidence or some form of dark humor remains largely debated. Still, it seems the Emperor tolerated their tactics and gave them more leeway than most of his other legions, as did Horus. When he became War Master, it seems he understood that they both knew the value of a blade that could cut quietly, even if no one could entirely be sure of who was wielding the blade. In combat, the Alpha Legion was a study in contrast. Their strategies combined surgical precision strikes with ruthless excess. They were a veritable masterpiece of planning, followed by actions of shocking cruelty, espionage, infiltration, sabotage. They wielded these tools unmatched within the Imperium. Only the Raven Guard could rival them in stealth or subterfuge. But while the Raven Guard fought to minimize suffering, the Alpha Legion seemed to almost enjoy the chaos they caused. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies in glorious combat, they wanted to dismantle them, slowly, psychologically, as entire civilizations would be turned against themselves before a single shot was fired. By the time the Alpha Legion would strike, their victims were already broken, and their armies a tangled mess of fear and confusion. And then would come the Harrowing. This would be less of a battle and more of a dissection, a synchronized assault from 100 different directions at once, drop pods, strike cruisers, and Alpha Legion agents appearing without warning, ground assaults coordinated with pinpoint orbital strikes preceding them, each attack precisely calibrated to exploit confusion which had already been strewn in the weeks prior. Even months, at times, if the enemy took longer to take down. To many of the other legions, this wasn't war, it wasn't noble, it was murder, efficient and absolute. Despicable to some, praiseworthy to others. To their enemies, they were nightmares made flesh, a force that could be anywhere, anyone, everyone, and no one at once. To their allies, they were an uneasy presence, too clever, too quiet, too interested in why everyone else was fighting, as if they were testing the answers. Officially, the Alpha Legion burned bright but briefly during the Great Crusade. Yet for all their victories and all the blood they spilled, they were never truly trusted or truly seen as true compatriots. So, in turn, they studied other legions, copied their tactics, adapted them in ways that made even the Ultramarines uneasy. Guilliman himself once dismissed them as students who learned all the wrong lessons. But if there's one thing Imperial history teaches any of us, it is that with the Alpha Legion, the truth is a lie and everything is permitted, as nothing will ever be certain. Because even now, 10,000 years after the heresy, there are still whispers, fleeting reports of coordinated strikes, sabotage operations, and unknown fleets moving in perfect silent synchronicity. At times, these agents, in fact, do seem to help the Imperium's overall goals. At others, they destabilize entire sectors. As the final years before the heresy come to a close, whispers had begun to circle around the 20th Legion. Whispers that the Hydra was turning inwards, perhaps simply revealing what it has always been, or as some others posit, they might have even been given a secret task by the Emperor. The Alpha Legion's brilliance had never once been questioned, but neither had its secrecy. That combination over time became a dangerous thing. As their victories grew, so did suspicion amongst their peers. Other legions began to murmur. Could they trust a force that never fought the same way twice, that seemed to keep its true strength hidden even from its allies? Conflicts followed. Alpharius' manner was cold, calculating, and often irreverent. This made enemies of more than one of his brothers. Guilliman of the Ultramarines and Mortarion of the Death Guard both openly clashed with him on multiple occasions. Their disputes recorded during the aftermath of the Ulnor Triumph and the Vasilis Uprising. Even Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, never once to mince words, branded Alpharius and his Alpha Legion as honorless assassins unfit to bear the Emperor's mark. This insult nearly drew bloodshed between their officers, a duel of honor that only the Emperor's direct intervention prevented. This occurred following the fall of Fortress Jorkla during the Alvaron Compliance, and Dorn wasn't alone in his open contempt. Conrad Kurz, the pathetic primarch of the Night Lords, hardly a paragon of moral virtue himself, would often accuse the 20th Legion of hiding their sins in the shroud of lies. The Thousand Sons themselves were always wary of any truth or knowledge hidden from them, leading to Magnus's sons avoiding the 20th entirely whenever possible. No one learned precisely why they were so openly averse to them, as opposed to other secrets that the Thousand Sons could hope not avoid. Perhaps this was one of the few times they believed it was better not to look too closely. Yet for all the friction, the Alpha Legion wasn't entirely without friends. Horus Lupercal, the War Master-to-be, saw something in them that he considered valuable. To him, the Alpha Legion was a scalpel where others were hammers. Their methods brutal, efficient, but clean in regards to the Legion itself. He would even go so far as to call Alpharius a kindred spirit. However believable that is, since similar honeyed words is how he seduced Mortarion into joining the traitors, as he saw Alpharius and his legion as a weapon of precision in an age of grand slaughter. Under Horus's command, the Alpha Legion would thrive, gaining freedoms no other legion enjoyed. It must also be noted that they fought beside the Dark Angels and the Iron Hands without incident. This was a rarity to say the least, as these two were viewed as some of the more abrasive legions to work with, and the Alpha Legion was noted as masters of integrating mortal forces and combined arms tactics into their repertoire, using them as pieces in their vast unseen equations of war, coldly and efficiently, without regard for how many pieces they left behind on the board, at least to an imperial historiator's perspective. However, it is important to note that despite all this negativity surrounding them, results spoke for themselves. No other legion was as effective in rooting out rebellion, unmasking treachery, or erasing Xenos threats that had slipped between the cracks of the Great Crusade. They became the Emperor's veritable shadow, one sent to deal with problems too dangerous or too subtle for the rest of their kin. But shadows have a way of growing darker, growing longer, unrestrained. When Horus ascended to the rank of War Master, he would go on to give Alpharius near total autonomy. The 20th Legion would then fracture into countless fleets, supposedly operating independently, often fighting alongside or interacting directly with rogue traitors, pushing far beyond the Imperium's borders. At first, it seemed a perfect use for their unique talents, and a way to keep them away from the brothers who held no small amount of animosity towards them. But over time, patterns changed. Reports, fragmented and redacted, began to reach both Terra and the Vengeful Spirit. Even Horus, by then one of, if not the single most powerful man in the galaxy, began to question if he truly commanded the Alpha Legion, or if they had simply convinced him that he did. The tone of their campaigns had shifted. Some Imperial observers noted that the Legion appeared to choose conflicts not for their strategic value, but for sport, as if the complexity of the hunt was what mattered itself more than the victory. However, some observers from within the Alpha Legion would note that it appeared as though the Alpha Legion had one prerogative: maintain humanity's momentum. To which end, that is unknown, but it seemed the Alpha Legion was almost obsessed from keeping the mathematics of humanity stagnant. There always had to be conflict, always change. Movement was necessary. Movement was life. The rest did not seem to matter. The most infamous case occurred on Tresta Prime. Rather than swiftly capturing the capital and ending the war, Alpharius ordered the defenders to be allowed to dig in. The Alpha Legion orchestrated a nightmare of sabotage, misinformation, ambushes, where the enemy's own weapons were turned against them. 90% of the casualties occurred before the inevitable surrender. But strangely enough, those who were left behind seemed to be far more skilled and talented than the rest. When the question of why they hadn't taken a simpler path, Alpharius only answered, because it would have been too easy. Guillemin's response was sharp as expected. In a formal protest to Horus directly, he condemned the operation as a wasteful exercise in cruelty and a mockery of the Great Crusade's purpose. From that day, the Ultramarines and the Alpha Legions would never fight alongside each other again. And still, the Hydra kept winning. Its victories mounted, even as its methods grew darker and more obsessive. But amongst the Imperial Court, a belief would begin to spread that the Alpha Legion had become addicted to destruction, that they no longer sought compliance, but the perfect path to perfect subversion, to reduce worlds not to obedience, but to chaos, ruin, as a means to prove their own superiority. Some within the Imperial Court called it arrogance, others pathology. The War Master dismissed this as merely a rumor. Perhaps he even enjoyed the thought of a legion that defied easy understanding. But in truth, well, with the Alpha Legion, it may be simpler, it may be something far simpler, or so complicated that it is functionally simpler not to understand. As the heresy neared, the Alpha Legion functionally vanished into the dark frontier, splitting its fleets once again, changing names, erasing trails. The Imperium lost track of them, if they ever actually had track of them at all. And in that darkness, they multiplied. Each report contradicted the next. Each identity dissolved into another. No one knew what they were doing. No one knew who they truly served, and perhaps neither did they. But to better understand the mistrust and animosity surrounding the Alpha Legion, we must take a closer look into the many campaigns that bred such a reputation. Starting on Tresta Prime, a world whose fate illustrated both the genius and, well, creative cruelty of the 20th Legion. Tresta was a world bound in an iron alliance of totalitarian colonies known as the Conservation, and had survived the age of strife through rigid eugenic control, fortitude, and the fortunate happenstance of isolation. Their society was a lattice of caste and obligation, each citizen enslaved to the needs of their civilization. And for the Imperium, each civilization and each citizen was a potential liberation and conversion waiting to happen. When Imperial envoys arrived, they were met with gunfire. The Conservation's worlds had prepared for defense, and in response, the War Master Horus diverted two expeditionary fleets, one commanded by Reboot Guillimin and the other by Alpharius. Guillimin immediately struck at the outer worlds, constricting the Conservation's military as if his forces were a tightening noose. Alpharius, by contrast, Alpharius circled, probed, created raids, caused disappearances, and led phantom strikes, seemingly at random, but always surgical. Guillimin, growing increasingly frustrated, openly berated Alpharius in council. His argument was simple: emulate the Ultramarines' efficiency, and the Conservation could be brought to heel within mere solar months. However, Alpharius ignored him. Instead, the 20th Legion employed the tactics that they had honed since their earliest campaigns as the Ghost Legion: infiltration, intelligence gathering, the subtle orchestration of chaotic disarray. To the Tracens, the Alpha Legion seemed to flit like shadows on the periphery of existence, threatening but never committing. This provoked strategic errors, as the Conversation committed more troops to the wrong places, leaving the very capital of this conglomerate vulnerable and supply lines dangerously exposed. When the assault finally struck, it was from every direction, all at once. Sabotage tore through Tresta Prime's infrastructure. Strike forces appeared in the heart of the capital, and the defenders were caught in a web of traps so complex and so Machiavellian that it would make a chess master weep. Bridges exploded as divisions tried to redeploy. Communications were intercepted, altered, or obliterated. Orders failed to reach the front lines. The harrowing of Tresta Prime, as chronicles would call it, was total and absolute. Super heavy armored columns of the 20th Legion moved with a mechanical, almost automaton warhammer-like precision, striking where the enemy was already weakened, leaving naught but devastation in their wake. The world's regime and infrastructure collapsed. Riots, fires, famine, and disease swept through the streets. Of the planet's nearly 11 billion inhabitants, an estimated 90% would perish in the infighting or in the aftermath of the Alpha Legion strike, leading the capital to capitulate within days. Yemen formally protested against Alpharius' tactics directly to Horus, calling them dishonorable and untrustworthy of an Astartes. Horus, ever the intelligent strategist, praised Alpharius' execution as masterful, since it led to Alpharius' own forces suffering almost no casualties. To Guilliman, this was a slap to the face, leaving to Guilliman and Alpharius never serving alongside one another during the rest of the Great Crusade. After this campaign, the Alpha Legion's trace would vanish into the outer dark, leaving only speculation and ruin behind. We must next move to the final campaigns of the Imperial Fist, which were led directly by Rogal Dorn. This would be on the unmanned hive world governed by a stubborn ruler known as the World Prince. Initially, Dorn's forces fought methodically, hive by hive, slowly dismantling any resistance. But then, unexpectedly, the Alpha Legion arrived. They claimed to be allies, though no member was seen directly by Dorn's force, and yet the evidence of their presence was unmistakable. Uprisings occurred, coups ignited, and the planet descended into anarchy faster than Dorn's sons could fortify. Over 400 nobles would be executed in rapid succession, and the World Prince would quickly surrender. Dorn confronted Alpharius directly, enraged at the Alpha Legion's underhanded methods, despite their effectiveness. He ordered them to cease all operations and depart, detailing with meticulous precision every flaw in their campaign before leaving, all but muttering in disgust at what he had considered a disreputable approach to war. The next campaign, that brought no small amount of ill repute to the Legion, will take us to the desert world of Nurth, a lost colony discovered in the final years of the Great Crusade by the 670th Expeditionary Fleet, under Lord Commander Denga Nijamastra. Nurth, a planet of harsh, unyielding deserts, had rejected the light of the imperial truth, preferring instead the rigid hierarchies of its pre-industrial society. Attempts to negotiate were only met with gunfire, leaving the imperial army with no choice but a full compliance operation. Primarch Alpharius and elements of the 20th Legion, or at least what is believed to be elements of the 20th Legion, and depending who you asked, no elements of the 20th Legion, joined the Expeditionary Fleet. And though they were never formally incorporated into its order of battle, the Expeditionary Fleet's leader retained nominal command as always. However, whenever Alpharius was present, the Primarch's will was effectively directing the campaign. Nurth itself, at first glance, was a standard desert world, yet upon closer inspection, one would note rather revealing anomalies, hinting at a history far older than what was believed initially. The harbor of Mondo, for example, appeared natural, but only to the untrained eye, as it was actually an artificial construction, the remnants of a way station built by the Xenos Cabal over 11 millennia prior. Similarly, the town known as Tel Kat, also known as Visages, was surrounded by plains dotted with weathered sculptures of human heads ranging from the size of a pebble to large boulders. Their purpose lost to time. The planet's stark red and orange sands under a painstakingly beautiful, piercing blue sky made glare protection essential to survival on the world, which made it even more difficult for the natives of the planet to notice what was around them. As the campaign progressed, the Nurth themselves delivered the planet's death blow. Facing an imminent defeat, the chaos-tainted Evereth activated a black cube. This was an ancient weapon of planetary devastation. Within days, it transformed the world's climate into a lethal furnace of noxious winds and infinitely scaling temperatures, scorching the soil, boiling the oceans, and leaving the world utterly lifeless. However, we cannot be certain that it was not, in fact, the Alpha Legion's doing, since after this they would mysteriously vanish. Next, we must turn our sights to the Kaivas Veld, where scattered orc tribes, battered and leaderless after the Ulnar Crusade, had regrouped to harass nearby human systems. The Alpha Legion tracked them down, petitioning Horus for reinforcements. The Luna Wolves, still reeling from prior engagements, declined. However, the ever-noble Blood Angels under Sanguinius would step forward. Alpharius promised a 5-year campaign. However, Sanguinius, ever the optimist, insisted it would be done in one. It seems his gift of foresight was correct, at least in large part. The campaign itself unfolded as a deadly game of cat and mouse. Orc fleets fled the belt, chased by the Alpha Legion in successive waves, only to encounter waiting Blood Angels who chased them down relentlessly, as if they were sharks who had smelled blood in the water, chasing them down through dense asteroid fields, engaging in ship-to-ship combat, which would stretch across weeks. This was a veritable grueling ballet of lancefire and torpedo blasts. Yet in the background of the system, the 20th Legion's expeditionary fleet moved, generally unseen, guiding the orcs into a trap, with only sporadic communiques instructing the Blood Angels where to maintain the line. Eventually, the Blood Angels dared probe deeper, seeking signs of their allies, not due to mistrust but rather worry. However, what they would find would be nothing but wreckage, orc vessels shattered, alien crews utterly annihilated. Hundreds of Alpha Legion warships had seemingly operated in complete secrecy, hurting the enemy with the precision and control of a sheephound before vanishing without a trace. By the campaign's conclusion, the last orc remnants in the sector would be completely extinguished, and the 20th Legion claimed full responsibility for exterminating the biological infestation. Yet true to form, their methods would remain largely obscure, but it would guarantee that any spores or remnants of the orcs would vanish in their entirety. However, this is one of the few situations where, despite from the outside seeming mistrustful, the relation between the 9th and the 20th would remain one of the more cordial relationships the Alpha Legion would ever have. With this understanding, it may be easier to understand why the Alpha Legion, of all legions, found itself aligned with Horus when the War Master embraced chaos and struck against the Emperor. The records are clear. Their martial pride, combined with Alpharius' almost pathological avoidance of direct contact with his loyalist Primarch siblings, and what contact he had was rather negative, save for Horus and maybe Sanguinius, set the stage for catastrophe. Yet what makes the Alpha Legion's turn to chaos particularly perplexing was ostensibly for the sake of the Imperium itself. This is because during a campaign of Imperial compliance upon Earth, roughly 2 standard years prior to the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the twin Primarchs were approached by an individual known as John Grammaticus, an agent of the alien cabal. Alongside him were 2 companions, Petros Soneca and a sacker known as Shire. The cabal revealed to Alpharius Omegon a vision of the future, the impending rise of Horus as War Master and the interstellar civil war that would ensue. 2 divergent paths were presented to them. If the Emperor triumphed, the Imperium would eventually stagnate and slowly decay over 10 to 20 millennia until the galaxy itself and trillions of human souls were consumed by chaos. If Horus won, he would, in the generations following, be racked with guilt for slaying their father. Yet in doing so, he would obliterate all chaos-tainted factions, and humanity itself would burn in a near constant state of internecine warfare, seeing as no other enemies would remain. Now, in this scenario, chaos would be eliminated in its entirety, however at the horrifying cost to humanity as a whole. The twin Primarchs recoiled at this revelation, and yet in their eyes, following Horus and manipulating the path from there became their only way to safeguard humanity from the very corruption that the Imperium could seemingly not prevent. Their loyalty remained with the Emperor as a whole, as during certain events, Alpharius and or Omegon would warn loyalists and actively act to decrease the cost of lives on the loyalist side, sabotaging chaos, though not in a way that would wholly allow the loyalists true victory. Because despite the Cabal's predictions, Alpharius and Omegon chose a different path. If both directions ended with humanity suffering a terrible fate in a mere 20,000 years, they would act in a way that would balance the scales. No path would be taken, no side would be allowed to win, and the Great Game would be used to perpetuate the existence of humanity for as long as possible, regardless of the amount of suffering that it would incur. In this way, it is within the twisted calculus of the 20th Legion that a stalemate had to be reached, one of enduring devotion, where the balance of the Great Game would be maintained, not by the powers of humanity's God King, and not by the entities, the gibbering psychic gestalts who saw themselves as gods. This is to the point that some believe that now that the balance of the scales has been tilted so far into the side of chaos, that the Alpha Legion seeks to free the Emperor from his prison upon the Golden Throne, forcing balance in a heavy-handed way. When the heresy erupted at the atrocity of Isvan III, it seems the Alpha Legion had a hand in some of the traitors' lines being rather permeable. But as the Horus heresy was about to truly take shape, the Alpha Legion was poised for action. At Isvan V, it seems a large part of the traitors' actual planning for the Dropsite Massacre would come from Alpharius and Omegon, as a force estimated at around 50,000 legionaries directly under Alpharius' command would respond to Rogol Dorn's orders to attack the traitor legions. This contingent was drawn from at least 2 separate expeditionary fleets, who had recently returned to the forge world of Lucius for resupply after extended campaigns along the galactic fringe, as for years prior the Alpha Legion seemed to have been almost utterly absent from the Great Crusade, fostering the illusion at least of loyalty to Terra's high command. Dorn, confident in their neutrality, could not have suspected a web of infiltration and subterfuge, which the Alpha Legion had so clearly woven. However, neither could Horus. As the Dropsite Massacre was about to start, one of the twin primarchs, or both, had decided to act, as they directly warned Corax, Vulcan, and Ferris before the battle to be cautious, as Alpharius contacted Corax, hoping him and Vulcan could persuade Ferris, who had lost his head to his temper, not to attack immediately, openly telling the primarchs of the Shattered Legions that Horus was clearly baiting them into attack, and that their forces rushing as they were right now and being the first on the planet was utter insanity. Alpharius instead directly asked Ferris Manus to siege Isvan, to use his vast depth of skills in order to preserve his forces. At the same time, it seems a few select words were passed on to the Primarchs, and Angron's buttons were intentionally pushed, as even at this time he believed in the nobility of gladiatorial combat, a force being met with force, yet he was assigned to work with Fulgrim, who at this time believed, much like Horus, that the Dropsite Massacre would have to be fought in a more demonic way. All the while, Mortarion was further and further pushed to work with demonic forces. Each of these incidents had the traitor forces almost destabilized at this point, with Angron having to be forced to cease his attempted attacks on Fulgrim for desiring the Loyalists be given a fair chance to fight, and Mortarion threatened outright rebellion if he was pushed any further to working with Horus's demonic allies. Furthermore, Alpharius would have his own forces actively work to preserve some of the Loyalist forces, not so many as to seem disloyal or to have turned on Horus, but enough to keep the Loyalists alive, despite the Loyalists having done everything in their power to have their forces exterminated, with their actions causing a gum-up of Horus's rebellion, leading to a significantly longer amount of time being wasted by the traitors in Isvan V. However, with how foolhardy the Loyalists had been, for Alpharius' plans to continue with the least amount of deviation, he had to set his forces to slaughter everyone they could at the Ogral Depression, and to steal the literal faces off dead Raven Guard members. Functionally, the Legion worked in 2 ways now. One Primarch actively tried to help the traitors, while the other fought against them. This would function as a third path, one the Cabal had not seen, as both paths suggested by the Cabal were seen as unacceptable. However, the Alpha Legion would indeed often follow Horus's plans, not to the letter, but generally in spirit. Yet even Horus, for all his confidence in the Alpha Legion's loyalty, seemed to notice the influence of their operations, supplies misdirected, orders subverted, allies pitted against each other, chaos cultivated carefully within chaos's own shadow. Yet even then, despite Horus distrusting them, he knew their loyalty was conditional and their motives unreadable to him. It seems it took Horus far too long to realize once the Hydra was finally enchained, history would prove all the Legion's mistrust upon the Alpha Legion to be correct. To better understand how things went, we must dive a little bit deeper into the Imperial's own perspective of the Dropsite Massacre. The Dropsite Massacre still remains to Imperials as one of the most devastating events in the Adeptus Astartes history, where the Iron Hands were all but eliminated, the Raven Guard reduced to near extinction, and the Salamanders left as mere cinders of their once glorious pyre. Their survival was only owed to what the Imperials believed was initiative, luck, and quick thinking. Following Horus's treachery on Isstvan III, Rogaldorn, on direct instruction from the Emperor, mobilized at least 7 loyalist Space Marine legions, or what he believed them to be 7 loyalist Space Marine legions, to strike at Horus's fortification on Isstvan V. The assault would be divided into 2 waves under Ferrus Manus' overall command. The first wave would be the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands, and the Salamanders, who would secure the drop site at the Old Girl Depression, but this would be at a great cost. Unbeknownst to them, the second wave, which was made up of the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and a contingent of the Word Bearers, had pledged themselves to Horus and were lying in wait to strike at their flank. The Loyalists, believing these forces were their allies, would now be trapped between 2 waves of traitors. Ferrus Manus, against the warnings of Corvus Corax and Vulcan, pursued what he would believe was a retreating enemy, only to be confronted by his brother Primarch Fulgrim in mortal combat. And so the Iron Hands were cut off and slaughtered to a man, Morlock Terminators included, and Ferrus Manus would be the first Primarch to die. During the Horus Heresy, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard would be forced to break out under heavy fire, having lost the majority of their forces, as they had to use a myriad of Thunderhawk and Stormbird gunships to attempt to carry the survivors to some form of safety. And they would be the ones to tell the Imperium about this unmitigated disaster. Corax himself would be gravely injured, and Vulcan's whereabouts were unknown for a time, many believing he had been slaughtered. But due to his perpetual nature, he would survive literally being nuked, and the Iron Hands would be left broken, leaderless, and decimated. And here, as always with the 20th Legion, one must remember what little we know about the Alpha Legion, what remnants exist of its history, can never truly form a coherent pattern. However, what the Imperium has at this point surmised is that with the Alpha Legion there are known knowns, and that there are known unknowns. But most importantly, there are also unknown unknowns, things that we don't know, that we don't know. And so the Alpha Legion's involvement in the Horus Heresy would officially commence.